Welcome to True Echo, where real voices rise, and silence speaks louder than hate. Today's story will shake you to your core. It's about what happens when a calm black teen gets struck in open court, only to reveal a truth that makes the entire system stop cold. This isn't just about power. It's about perception. And what happens when justice shows up in the most unexpected way. The courtroom was already tense when Quentin Ray stepped forward. 17, clean white button-up shirt, spine straight. He looked like any other teenager trying to navigate a grown world, except Quentin wasn't just any kid. Not that anyone knew that yet. Sergeant Nolan Krell did not know. Or worse, he didn't care. When the officer struck him, open palm, loud, unforgiving, the room didn't gasp right away. People just froze. As if they needed a moment to process what they'd just seen. But Quentin didn't flinch. He didn't cry. He didn't back away. He simply turned his face, slowly, and asked, "May I speak to my father?" That sentence cracked the silence more than the slap had. Judge Lena Brewster sat stunned on the bench. Her mouth opened, then closed. Even the prosecutor, Ronald Blaylock, looked like he'd forgotten how to breathe. Krell, still towering by the stand, lowered his hand, but not because he regretted anything. His face read something else, the beginning of fear. Quentin's voice didn't shake. "Justice Aurelian Ray." And just like that, the air shifted. The name alone, Justice Aurelian Ray, cut through the room like a gavel-striking bone. People sat up straighter. One juror actually leaned back like they were dodging heat. The court clerk stumbled, nearly dropping her stack of notes. Krell's lips parted slightly, as if trying to form a response but coming up with nothing. For the first time in minutes, Judge Brewster spoke. "Did you say Justice Aurelian Ray? Of the United States Supreme Court?" Quentin gave one nod. Precise. Controlled. In that moment, Quentin was no longer just a black teen in a courtroom. He was the son of the law itself. And everyone knew they had just seen something they could not take back. Still, Quentin didn't look triumphant. He didn't smirk. He didn't even blink. His eyes stayed locked on the judge, his posture unshaken, as if all of this, had happened before. Maybe not the slap, but the misjudgment. The assumption. The disbelief that came only when the pedigree was revealed. Krell tried to justify himself now, his voice lowering to almost a mutter. "I thought he was reaching. I thought he looked like." "I sneezed," Quentin said, interrupting. "I raised my hand to cover my mouth." Another wave of silence. He didn't say it with sass. He didn't inject anger. He stated it like it was a plain fact, because it was. And that simplicity made the room feel even heavier. Then the courtroom doors swung open. A man stepped through. Tall. Charcoal suit. Silver hair, brushed perfectly. Face like it had been carved by time and responsibility. He walked with the kind of command that doesn't ask for silence, it creates it. Justice Aurelian Ray didn't look left. Didn't scan the room. He walked straight toward the bench, toward Quentin. Like a man who had already been briefed by the walls. The jurors rose instinctively. Judge Brewster stood. Even Sergeant Krell straightened like a soldier in front of a general. But it was too late. Justice Ray said just one sentence. "Who laid hands on my son?" No theatrics. No booming voice. Just raw, concentrated authority. Krell didn't speak. His mouth opened, but sound refused to follow. Judge Brewster stammered. "Justice Ray, this isn't procedure." Ray turned his head slightly toward her, never raising his voice. "Procedure was broken the moment a court officer assaulted my son during live testimony." There it was. The hammer. And it didn't need to fall loudly, it only needed to be heard. The courtroom wasn't a place for spectacle that morning. It became something else entirely, a reckoning chamber. Quentin stayed quiet, sitting again, as his father took control of a room that moments ago had treated him like nothing. You didn't restrain him, Ray continued, now facing Krell directly. You didn't warn him. You struck him. Krell's jaw clenched. He raised his hand, I thought. You thought, Justice Ray echoed. That's the problem. Not a single soul in that courtroom dared look away. Quentin sat with his hands resting gently on his lap, just as his father had taught him. Stillness was not weakness, it was control. And in that moment, while the courtroom pulsed with tension, he wasn't just a teenager anymore. He was a mirror reflecting everything this institution claimed to stand for, and everything it had failed to protect. Justice Ray turned toward Judge Brewster, his voice unwavering. This is not about my position, he said, this is about precedent. The words dropped like stones into the quiet. If a court officer, he continued, can assault a witness, mid-testimony, in full view of the bench, and walk away with his badge intact, then justice isn't being served. It's being performed. For show. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Even Krell, whose presence had filled the room moments ago, now looked like a man standing too close to fire. He opened his mouth again, perhaps to apologize, perhaps to explain, but Justice Ray didn't give him space for it. You didn't see a threat, Ray said. You saw an image. You filled in the rest. Judge Brewster leaned forward at last, grasping at the formality of her position like a lifeline. Sergeant Krell, you are hereby relieved of courtroom duty effective immediately. You will surrender your badge and service weapon pending an internal investigation. There was a ripple of murmured approval from the gallery, but Justice Ray's expression remained firm. With all due respect, he said, it cannot be internal only. I'll be requesting an independent investigator through the Department of Justice. That, finally, pulled a visible reaction from Krell. His eyes darted toward his attorney, then the bailiff, then the exit. The gravity of what he'd done, not just the slap, but the assumptions behind it, was now undeniable. And irreversible. Quentin hadn't moved from his seat. He didn't gloat. Didn't glance sideways. He sat in the eye of the storm his presence had summoned, still anchored in something deeper than righteousness. The judge hesitated. Understood, she said quietly. Justice Ray gave a nod, then took a step back, not as a retreat, but as a statement, my part is said. Now the rest of you decide what kind of courtroom this really is. The prosecutor Blaylock stepped forward again. Mr. Ray, he said gently, would you like to continue your testimony? Quentin looked up. Yes, sir. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't a performance. It was duty. He walked slowly back to the stand and took his seat. The entire courtroom leaned in, not out of curiosity, but out of a new, earned respect. Describe the moment Beau Halderman made contact, Blaylock said. Quentin's eyes didn't waver. He shoved me, he said calmly. I didn't shove back. He did it again. I stepped away. Blaylock paused. Why didn't you react? Quentin looked across the sea of faces. This time, his voice was louder. Because I knew it wouldn't be seen the same way. That sentence didn't just hang in the air, it weighed it down. The courtroom was no longer debating guilt or innocence. The real trial had already taken place in the span of 5 minutes. A slap. A silence. A revelation. And now a truth that couldn't be unseen. The rest of the hearing moved like molasses, slow, dense, heavy with meaning. No one interrupted Quentin again. Not the judge. Not the attorneys. And certainly not another officer. Every word he spoke carried gravity, not because of volume, but because of restraint. The courtroom had been redefined not by the testimony, but by the dignity of the witness delivering it. When the defense attorney, Howard Sedgwick, rose to cross-examine, his tone was visibly subdued. "Quentin," he began, voice less polished now, "you say you didn't respond physically. Not even instinctively." "No," Quentin replied, "because instinct isn't always safe when you look like me." A few jurors shifted. One woman put a hand to her mouth. Sedgwick blinked, looked at his notes, then folded them quietly. He didn't ask another question. That was the moment people realized, no legal tactic was going to make this look better. No clever phrasing could walk them back from what had just unfolded in front of the entire room. Quentin didn't need to win them over. He had already told the truth. Now the rest of the court had to live with it. When Judge Brewster called a recess, the gallery emptied slowly. Phones stayed pocketed. No one dared break the quiet with casual gossip. Because no one could forget the sound that had broken the silence earlier. Outside, in the hallway, Quentin sat on a wooden bench near the vending machine. His father stood a few feet away, hands behind his back, posture straight as ever, like he was still on the bench. "Do you think they'll do anything real?" Quentin asked after a long stretch of silence. "They already are," Justice Ray replied, not unkindly. "They're listening." "Listening's not the same as acting." "No," his father agreed. "It never is. But listening is where it starts." The boy looked forward. "They only listen because of you." Justice Ray didn't flinch at the truth. "Maybe. But what they heard came from you. It wasn't a comfort. It was a confirmation." Because Quentin had lived this script before, at school, in stores, at social functions where people's tone shifted once they learned who his father was. And that was always the bitter catch, being seen only when power walked in behind you. But in court that day, Quentin had stood alone before his father entered. He'd taken the slap. Endured the scrutiny. Maintained his composure. That moment, that silence, belonged to him. Inside the courtroom, Judge Brewster returned to the bench, her face more serious than earlier. She read through her findings with clinical precision. The court finds that Beau Halderman's actions constitute targeted harassment. Suspension with behavioral intervention is recommended effective immediately. Then she turned toward the officer. This court also formally requests an external investigation into Sergeant Nolan Krell's conduct. His badge will remain suspended pending federal review. The words weren't shouted. But they struck with clarity. Krell didn't object. He didn't even look up. He sat there, crumpling slowly in a chair that had once made him look invincible. Quentin sat still. The weight hadn't lifted. But it had shifted. The courthouse steps were swarming with reporters by the time Quentin and his father emerged. Cameras flashed like lightning. Boom mics dangled overhead like low-hanging fruit waiting to be bitten. Most of these people hadn't been there when the hearing started, they'd come for the aftermath. For the slap. For the name. For the spectacle. But Quentin didn't flinch here, either. A reporter stepped forward, microphone extended. "Justice Ray, any comment on what happened inside today?" Justice Ray paused, not because he was unsure, but because he measured words like a surgeon handles a scalpel. "I came to see my son testify," he said evenly. "I left with a reminder." "A reminder of what?" another reporter asked. "That civility doesn't begin with a uniform," he said. "It begins with discipline. And respect must not only be expected, it must be shown." He said nothing more. They moved past the reporters, through the crowd, into the waiting black car at the curb. Quentin stared out the window. He didn't feel proud or angry or vindicated. He felt tired. The kind of tired that doesn't come from one incident, but from everything that led to it. Back in Bloomington, Minnesota, things didn't go back to normal, but they quieted. At school, some teachers gave Quentin space, others offered awkward words of praise. A few classmates whispered apologies, even if they'd never actually said anything before. Others avoided him completely. Not out of guilt, but fear. The kind of fear that comes when someone like Quentin exposes a truth people have been trying hard not to see. Bo Halderman didn't say a word. His family pulled down his father's campaign posters. Their lawyer disappeared from local TV. It was like they were trying to vanish without admitting what had happened. But that wasn't the important part. The real shift happened in places without microphones, in classrooms, in school hallways, in cafeteria corners. Students who had never once spoken up about fairness or bias started asking questions. Teachers took notice. So did parents. And Quentin? He stayed the same. He didn't give interviews. He didn't post rants online. He didn't become the face of any protest. He just kept showing up. Kept doing the work. Kept walking into rooms like he always had, calm, careful, watching how the world responded to him before he ever had a chance to say who he was. One night, 2 weeks after the hearing, Quentin sat across from his father at the kitchen table. No reporters. No bench. Just the slow tick of the antique wall clock and the clink of silverware being cleared. "You regret going through with it?" Justice Ray asked. Quentin shook his head slowly. "No. Just tired." His father nodded. "Tired is part of it. But tired isn't the end." Quentin exhaled, softly. "I just hate that it took that, for them to finally hear me." Justice Ray didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thin folder. Inside was a formal letter, from the U.S. Marshal Service. The Department of Justice had opened an official review. Not just into Krell's actions that day, but into his entire history. Other complaints were being examined now. Ones no one had bothered to take seriously before. "They're watching now," Justice Ray said. Quentin didn't smile. But he nodded. Because that, finally, meant something. The weeks after the courtroom incident weren't filled with fanfare, they were filled with change. Quiet, slow, deliberate change. At Lincoln High, the administration quietly initiated new training protocols, not just for faculty, but for school security and local law enforcement stationed on campus. The curriculum didn't just focus on de-escalation or courtroom conduct. It went deeper. Implicit bias. Racial perception. The psychology of silence. Quentin's name was never mentioned in the paperwork, but everyone knew why the changes had begun. And it didn't stop there. In government buildings across the city, whispers started turning into discussions. Judges re-evaluated their courtroom procedures. Clerks questioned whether certain officers belonged near witnesses at all. And the footage of that moment, when Quentin had been struck, and stayed still, continued to circulate online. Not just as a meme. Not as a joke. But as a symbol. Because that image, Quentin's head turned slightly from the slap, eyes calm, hands lowered, held something that words couldn't. It wasn't submission. It was strength. And people responded. Community centers began holding forums about race and power in judicial spaces. Students invited speakers to debate club meetings. Teachers opened the door to harder conversations, ones that had been dodged for years. Parents showed up, many for the first time, to school board meetings, not just to defend their children, but to ask if their children were part of the problem. Still, not everyone responded with clarity. Some critics online insisted Quentin had baited Krell by moving too slowly. Others claimed it was a setup, that no officer would ever strike a witness in open court without provocation. But the video said otherwise. And it didn't matter how many people tried to spin it, because the silence that followed that slap had already spoken. And the world had already listened. At home, Quentin kept things simple. He applied to Brown like he'd always planned. He kept his GPA high. He kept attending debate club, though he now found himself sitting alone more often, people unsure of how to approach the boy whose silence had rattled an entire system. One afternoon, as he was packing his bag in the library, his advisor, Mrs. Gillis, stopped by his table. "You know," she said gently, "I used to call you composed. Like it was just a personality trait. But I think now I understand, it's something you carry." Quentin looked up at her, unsure of how to respond. "I'm sorry it took that for me to see it," she added. He gave her a quiet nod. Because what else was there to say? Even at the highest levels, change was happening. Justice Ray, though known for his reserved temperament, had submitted a private memorandum to the Office of Judicial Integrity, a bold move by Supreme Court standards. In it, he addressed the risks of unchecked authority, particularly when bias intersects with institutional power. That document, quietly circulated among federal judges, sparked a wave of internal audits across multiple states. It wouldn't make headlines. But it didn't have to. Because this story had already done its job. It had forced people to stop assuming. It had made people look. And most importantly, it had reminded every quiet, careful kid watching from the sidelines that stillness isn't surrender, it's strategy. The final days of Quentin's senior year came with fewer whispers and more glances of quiet respect. Not the kind you get from being feared or revered, but from being understood. There was no prom king nomination. No last-minute popularity surge. But when Quentin walked across the graduation stage, the applause he received wasn't forced or polite. It was real. Earned. Not because of what he'd endured, but because of how he endured it. After the ceremony, as families took photos under balloon arches and on the school's front lawn, Quentin stood near a tree off to the side, his cap in hand. His father approached, not with fanfare, but with presence. "Did you hear from Brown yet?" Justice Ray asked, adjusting the cuff of his suit jacket. Quentin nodded once, then pulled out a folded letter from his pocket and handed it over. His father unfolded it carefully, scanning the text. When his eyes reached the final line, he gave the briefest flicker of a smile, small, but unmistakable. "Congratulations," he said. "You did it." Quentin looked away for a second, scanning the crowd. "They accepted me, but I wonder what version of me they think they accepted." Justice Ray didn't try to soothe that ache. Instead, he folded the letter again and tucked it back into Quentin's hand. "The version that didn't flinch," he said. Because that was the image still floating through the internet like a warning and a memory, Quentin, unmoved, after the slap. His stillness wasn't a lack of reaction. It was a declaration, "I will not be remade by your assumptions." In the months that followed, Krell was formally dismissed after an independent DOJ investigation revealed 2 prior complaints, both involving excessive force and both previously buried. The public review forced a rewrite of courtroom officer conduct rules across the county. Bo Halderman transferred schools. His father resigned from the local school board race. There were no apologies, no media statements, just a retreat into silence. But for once, that silence wasn't power, it was the consequence of being seen. As summer approached, True Echo received hundreds of letters from students, parents, and even teachers who had seen the story go viral. Some shared their own experiences. Others just wrote 2 words, "Thank you." Quentin never replied to those. He didn't have to. His story had already traveled further than any reply could go. One evening, as he and his father sat on the back porch watching dusk settle over their quiet Bloomington neighborhood, Quentin finally asked something he hadn't before. "Why didn't you speak sooner, in the courtroom, I mean?" Justice Ray sipped his tea before answering. "Because the most powerful voice in the room wasn't mine," he said. "It was yours." Quentin nodded, letting that settle deep inside. And in that pause between 2 generations of quiet resilience, something shifted, not in the world, but in Quentin. A recognition that the courtroom had never defined him. But his silence within it had redefined what strength looked like, for everyone else. He didn't want to be a symbol. But symbols don't ask to be born. They rise when the world stops pretending not to see. What happened in that courtroom wasn't just about law, it was about perception, restraint, and what real strength looks like in the face of injustice. Quentin Ray didn't raise his voice. He didn't strike back. He stood still, and in doing so, he spoke louder than anyone ever could. As Justice Ray once told his son, "You don't have to be loud to be heard. Let the silence say what their noise can't." If this story moved you, if it made you pause, then share it. Let someone else remember Quentin's strength the next time the world mistakes calm for weakness. And if you believe that stories like this deserve a light, hit subscribe, leave a comment, and help us echo the truth further, because sometimes, justice begins in the moments we refuse to be ignored.